An unusual silence fell over Peppa Pig's house. Sunlight streamed through the windows, but brought no warmth. Peppa and George were playing in the garden, where a small, perfectly round piece of red velvet lay on the grass. It seemed so harmless, yet its presence felt alien. That evening, at dinner, Daddy Pig sat at the table, his eyes vacant, his lips moving silently as if repeating some ancient melody. He slowly raised his hand and pointed to an invisible spot in the air, his movements mechanical and devoid of all emotion. Mummy Pig tried to speak to him, but he didn't respond. The next morning, when Peppa woke up, she found Daddy Pig's pillow empty, with the same red velvet circle lying on it. Mummy Pig sat in the living room, her gaze distant, her lips silently repeating the same melody. She didn't cry, she didn't scream, she just sat there, immersed in her strange grief. George was playing with his toys, his eyes vacant, and he swayed from side to side, emitting a low, monotonous hum. Peppa tried to get his attention, but he didn't respond. She felt a cold fear creep into her heart. She looked in the mirror, and her reflection distorted, becoming pale and frightened. The melody from the forest, which she had heard before, now sounded much louder and seemed to be everywhere. She closed her eyes, trying to drown it out, but it only intensified. That night, as Peppa lay in her bunk bed, she heard George slowly getting out of the bottom bunk. His eyes were vacant, and he moved mechanically towards the window. Peppa tried to wake Mummy Pig, but she was in a deep, unnatural sleep. Peppa was left alone in the house, surrounded by the monotonous hum. She went to the window and saw a shadowy figure resembling a Squid Game guard standing in the distance. The figure slowly raised its hand, then lowered it. Mummy Pig came to the window, her eyes vacant, and she stared at the figure. The figure slowly raised its hand, then lowered it. Mummy Pig closed her eyes. Her lips began to silently repeat the chant. The red velvet circle lay on her pillow. The empty house filled with the melody, which became even deeper and richer, as if new voices had joined it. Peppa was left alone, surrounded by this ominous sound, which now seemed to be a part of her. She knew the game had begun, and she was in it alone. Evening came. Peppa Pig's house was full of the usual activity. Mummy Pig cooking dinner, Daddy Pig sorting papers, Peppa drawing, and George playing with dinosaurs. Suddenly, George went silent. He sat still, staring at one point, unresponsive to Peppa's voice. She moved closer, but he didn't react. His eyes were empty, as if seeing through her. Through the walls, through everything. This wasn't like George. His skin grew pale, his pink fading. Peppa grew uneasy and called Mummy Pig, but wasn't heard. She shook George. He was stiff, almost stone-like. She shouted louder. Mummy Pig came and grew worried too. Daddy Pig joined them. George seemed trapped in a trance. His breathing was shallow, and he felt weightless. The room turned cold, despite closed windows. Peppa shivered. George's eyes darkened. Mummy Pig hugged him, but he stayed cold. Daddy Pig suggested going to Dr. Elephant. Then George suddenly stood up. He slowly turned to Peppa, smiling unnaturally. It wasn't his smile. It was something alien. Peppa backed away. George walked toward her silently. Mummy and Daddy Pig tried to stop him, but he pushed them aside effortlessly. His strength was terrifying. Peppa tried to run, but her legs wouldn't move. George approached, eyes glowing with a cold, strange light. He reached out to her. She felt numb, paralyzed. He touched her. The world blurred. Colors faded. Sound vanished. Something inside Peppa began to dissolve. She was changing. The last thing she saw was George's eerie smile. She was no longer Peppa. She had become like him. Silence settled over the house. Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig stared at their children, both lifeless and hollow, eyes locked on nothing, faces pale and blank. They stood side by side like dolls. No one knew what had happened. No one knew what would come. There was no more laughter, only a cold, silent presence. and far beyond their world, something waited. It was just beginning. It wanted everyone, and it will. Very soon. It's already close. It's already here. The morning at Peppa Pig's house began as usual. The sun was shining, birds were singing, and Mummy Pig was making breakfast. Peppa and George sat at the table happily eating pancakes. Daddy Pig read the newspaper, snorting with satisfaction. Everything was peaceful, just like always. But something was different that day. George, normally cheerful and loud, was unusually quiet. He didn't ask for seconds, didn't laugh at Daddy Pig's jokes, and ignored his favorite toy, Dinosaur. Mummy Pig noticed first. "George, dear, are you all right?" she asked. He only nodded. His eyes were blank, and his smile looked painted on. Peppa tried to play with him, but he turned away, staring at nothing. At the playground, where laughter usually echoed, George stayed alone. He didn't run with Pedro Pony or jump in puddles with Rebecca Rabbit. His friends, Susie Sheep and others, tried to include him, but he just waved them off like he couldn't hear them. As days passed, George became worse. He avoided people, moved stiffly, and spoke in a flat tone. He stopped playing, drawing, or watching cartoons. The only thing that interested him was an old, worn book he found in the attic. He spent hours flipping through its pages, though it had no text or pictures, only strange symbols and patterns. Peppa tried to peek, but George clutched it tightly. His eyes were cold and distant, with no trace of his usual sparkle. One night, after everyone had gone to bed, Peppa heard strange noises from George's room. Not crying or laughter, something between a whisper and a rustle. She crept to the door and opened it slightly. George was sitting on the lower bunk, and above him, his dinosaur toy hung, gently swaying as if alive. George murmured to the book, his body trembling slightly. A strange smell filled the room, like old paper mixed with something Peppa couldn't place. A chill ran down her spine. She didn't know what was happening to her brother. The next morning, George was gone. His bed was empty, and the book lay open on the floor. On one page was a drawing that hadn't been there before, a silhouette of a piglet dissolving into the strange symbols. Peppa called Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig, but they only shrugged, thinking George was playing hide and seek. But Peppa knew better. Something had changed. The world felt wrong. Familiar sounds now seemed eerie. She stared at George's empty bed, her eyes full of something deeper than childish fear. Something had taken her brother. She didn't know if he'd ever return. And the scariest part, she began to notice how the shadows in the house grew longer, and the whispers became clearer. The morning in Peppa Pig's house began with an unusual silence. The sun barely penetrated the thick curtains, leaving the room in semi-darkness. George, usually sleeping on the bottom bunk, was motionless, and Peppa on top felt a strange numbness. Mummy Pig wasn't preparing breakfast. Daddy Pig wasn't reading the newspaper. The house was plunged into an unsettling quiet. Peppa came downstairs, her steps echoing in the empty hallway. She found her parents in the living room, sitting on the sofa, their gazes fixed on an old television broadcasting a strange show. Familiar faces of friends flashed across the screen. Susie Sheep, Pedro Pony, Rebecca Rabbit, but all of them were dressed in green tracksuits, and their faces expressed not childish delight, but eerie concentration. Beside them stood figures in red jumpsuits with black masks resembling guards. One of them, tall and slender, with a circle on his mask, turned to the camera. His voice, distorted by the speakers, said, "The game has begun." Peppa tried to call her parents, but they didn't react. Their eyes were empty, and their faces were frozen in indifference. She ran to the television trying to turn it off, but the buttons didn't work. The image on the screen became brighter, and Peppa saw Susie Sheep, usually so cheerful, performing some task with a stone face. Suddenly, there was a loud bang, and Susie disappeared. Only a green splatter remained in her place. Peppa recoiled in horror. She looked at her parents again. Their bodies trembled slightly in sync with what was happening on the screen, but their facial expressions remained unchanged. Suddenly, George appeared in the doorway. He was also dressed in a green suit, and his eyes were as black as the guards on the screen. "You're next," he whispered in a voice that wasn't George's. Peppa ran. She burst out of the house, but the world outside was just as alien and distorted. The sky was crimson, and the trees seemed twisted and dead. In the distance, she saw a giant doll, similar to the one in the show. Its head slowly turned, and Peppa heard a familiar melody. She ran without looking back, but knew there was no escape. Cold permeated her body, displacing fear. A new, unusually quiet windmill appeared in Peppa Pig's garden. It was a gift from Daddy Pig, initially bringing novelty and calm. Its blades rotated slowly, emitting a barely audible, lulling hum. Peppa and George were delighted. Mummy Pig found it peaceful. No one could have imagined this harmless object would become the source of something deeply unsettling. Mummy Pig began spending more time near the windmill. She listened to its monotonous hum, claiming to hear whispers, then instructions. Her speech became fragmented. She forgot daily chores, her gaze often distant, as if seeing something no one else could. George, mesmerized by the spinning blades, watched them for hours. He grew unnaturally quiet, his eyes wide and glassy. He started mimicking the windmill's slow, rhythmic motion, as if guided by an invisible force. Peppa was the first to notice the growing unease. She tried speaking with Mummy Pig and George, but their replies were hollow, often just repeated phrases that seemed to echo the windmill's hum. She felt increasingly isolated, surrounded by her family but unable to reach them. Daddy Pig dismissed her concerns at first, blaming fatigue or new interests. He tried to keep normal routines, but their detachment became too obvious and disturbing to ignore. Then a new neighbor arrived, Puss in Boots, styled like a Peppa Pig character. Curious and adventurous, he was immediately drawn to the windmill, but unlike the pig family, he sensed its sinister presence. He tried to engage with them, but their altered behavior made it nearly impossible. The windmill's influence deepened. Its hum filled every room. The family's movements aligned with its rhythm. They began seeing strange patterns in everyday objects, interpreting them as part of the windmill's truth. One night, Peppa, lying on the top bunk, noticed George was awake below. His eyes reflected a faint, pulsing light from the windmill outside. He whispered the same phrases Mummy Pig had repeated earlier. His voice was calm, flat, stripped of childlike emotion. Horror gripped Peppa. George was no longer himself. Daddy Pig finally realized the depth of the change. He tried to dismantle the windmill to break its hold, but Mummy Pig and George stood silently in his way. They didn't resist physically, but their stillness, their empty expressions, made him hesitate. One by one, the family was absorbed into the windmill's reality. They didn't vanish, but their minds were gone, taken. What remained were empty vessels, moving by the distorted logic of the windmill's hum. There was no violence, just quiet, complete assimilation. Seizing a moment when Puss in Boots distracted them, Peppa ran. She turned back to see her family, vacant-eyed, moving in sync with the windmill. The house itself seemed to vibrate with its hum.